I want to welcome everybody to our webinar. I'm joined by Kelley over at Insperity, and I appreciate her time and the Insperity team for helping put this together. My name is Kirk. I'm president of Renascence IT. We are a technology business partner based in the San Francisco Bay Area. We are a next generation managed service provider that looks at ways to reduce risk, increase productivity, and help with the bottom line of the business partners that we work with. And look forward to talking with you and learning from Kelley as well for the next hour. So our discussion today will be based a lot on how HR and IT need to work together to protect your company from both a cybersecurity and from an employee perspective. So there's a little bit more about me. Go to next slide. So I always like to start these with a few facts because people are like, well, I'm a small business, I won't be attacked, or it won't be that bad. But on average, hackers target businesses every 39 seconds, on average of over 2,200 times a day, and that number is only going up. There's over 300 million fraudulent sign-in attempts to Microsoft Cloud services every single day. 43% of cyber attacks target small businesses, and that is estimated to be up to 70 to 75% by the end of 2021. 98% of cyber attacks rely on social engineering, ways of criminals to try to get into your organization by appealing through various methods that we'll discuss. And on average, it takes a company 5 months to detect a potential data breach. And the average cost of a ransomware attack on a business is $133,000. So it can be quite expensive. So why do cyber criminals attack? Well, it's a business for them. Over $1.5 trillion of revenue was made by cyber criminals in 2020. To kind of put that as a reference point, that's more than the combined revenues of Apple, Facebook, Microsoft, Amazon, and Tesla in 1 year. And the revenue is expected to more than double by the end of 2021. And it is a business for cyber criminals. This was an actual ad on the right for a cyber criminal job. You can make $63,000 a month. Annual salary of $762,000, which was payable after a 90-day probationary period, of course, with an expected increase to $1.068 million after 2 years. And that's actually after having positive performance reviews. So this is a job for cyber criminals, and they make quite a bit of money. An example, because some people ask, well, what does a dark web look like? Is it shady? And the answer is no. So on the left here is an actual sale of 201 American Express cards in the Miami, Florida area. And I'd like to point out that their offering at this point was a holiday discount. So if you could get in early, you could probably save some money on obtaining some credit card information. And then on the right here, this was somebody selling over 773 million email and password combinations. And these ads also have ratings, just like eBay or any other shopping site, where they get rated on communication and quality. So you do well in the dark web, you'll get some 5-star ratings, and you can charge more for some of these dumps. So getting to the point here is, what is the biggest threat to your company? Close to 80% of breaches, compromises, and ransomware occur from one vector of attack. And many people may be surprised, many people may not, but it's your employees. So how do you stop this madness? How do you protect your business? Well, only you can prevent ransomware. And there are several things you can do. You can do phishing testing and training. And this is where you test your employees, and it keeps statistics of who may enter their credentials, who may click on random links, who may do certain things. And it's a good training practice, and I know that cyber insurance policies are now requiring it from various vendors. Dark web scans, like you saw before, Credentials are being sold constantly. There are services that will alert you when there's a breach from a third party, or if your domain email credentials are being shown up and being sold on dark websites. Two-factor authentication. This is where you enter a code when you are trying to log into, say, a service or your email. This is simple to do and can prevent a lot of attacks. Many people find it a nuisance that they have to enter a code when they need to log into their email. I always like to say the bigger nuisance is that you get hit with ransomware and you have to declare bankruptcy because you can't recover from it. I know Kelley will discuss these, so I'll go a little bit quickly through these. There are HR policies that you put in place. There are accounting policies that you put in place, social engineering policies, and insurance policies, specifically cyber liability insurance. And those policies can definitely help reduce attacks. So much so that education and awareness can reduce attacks against businesses by 90 to 95%. So there's things you can do to help prevent ransomware, to prevent breaches, and these are many of them. I appreciate your time. I'm going to turn it over to Kelley for her segment.
Hey, thank you, Kirk. Let me see if I can do this without messing up. There we go. And this is a little bit about me. I've been with Insperity for 17 years, going on 18 years, and I've held a variety of positions within the organization. I've been client-facing as an HR specialist, as well as managed a team of HR professionals up in the northern region, Northern California region, rather. I've been in our pre-sales group, and currently I work in an internal department doing HR compliance analysis for all of our clients. So you can find me on LinkedIn, and this is a little bit more information about myself. And like Kirk said, I'm going to be talking more about the policies that that can be put in place and what they look like, how they can help to support your company's efforts to avoid these types of attacks, or at least respond to them properly and manage that process. In addition, I'm going to talk about some of those ancillary things like working from home and personal devices that employees bring in. And I'm going to close with some training discussion around some of the things that will cross back into some of the information that Kirk's already shared. So when we talk about handbooks and we talk about policies within handbooks, there's two populations to really consider when you're talking about what kind of policies you want to put into place to protect against cyber threats. There are policies that are applicable to the business as a whole, and those are generally the ones that I have listed on the left here: the Internet Code of Conduct, use of communication systems, those types of policies that apply generally to the overall organization and to every employee in it. There are other policies that you can add that will either apply to a specific group, maybe not to everybody in the organization, but a department or a specific segment of your employee population, or a narrower focus policy that may be a subset of one of the ones on the left. So for example, the acceptable use policy may be a subset of the Internet Code of Conduct and provide a more focused view of what exactly is considered acceptable use when using the company's internet system and what is not considered acceptable use. Policies such as electronic funds transfer policy may be more appropriately targeted to, say, your accounting department or maybe some department that actually handles money and transfers back and forth. You likely wouldn't use this policy, for example, with the broader employee base, because if you're a manufacturing firm and you have drivers or people out on the manufacturing floor, they probably are not transferring electronic funds, and so that wouldn't really apply to them. So what you want to do when you're looking at these policies is to make sure that they're constructed properly, which is something I'll get into in a moment, but also that they're targeted to the proper audience. So in the construction of the policies, there's a few things that need to be made clear, and one of them is what it is you are addressing. So in the Internet Code of Conduct, you're going to talk about your internet system and what it is you expect of employees when they're using your internet system. And when you're talking about what their expectations are, the other thing you need to talk about is what your expectation that they will comply with the policy and how that is manifested. So rather than just say you need to comply with this policy, you need to be specific in your policy about what that means. That means that you will not visit inappropriate sites. You will not download a material that is not copyrighted for your organization, things of that nature. So the Internet Code of Conduct. The other critical piece to this is what will happen if the policy is violated. Because employees, when you tell them in any policy, it's not just policies that have to do with cyber control, but any policy you have, they should be told what the expectation is, how they are expected to comply with it, and then if they don't comply with it, what the expected repercussion is for their lack of compliance. And that's what sets you up to be able to manage these policies critically. The next thing, and this kind of goes, is kind of a second step to the handbook policies. If you see, we have a mobile use policy. On the other policies, there's also a bring your own device policy, which may be a parent policy to that mobile use policy. But when we talk about that, what does it mean to bring your own device? Well, if you allow your employees to use their personal devices to access your system, whether it's a cell phone or a tablet or their computer, their laptop or home computer, there are certain things to consider, because the span of control for a personal device that is owned by an employee is vastly different than the span of control that you as an organization have over a piece of equipment that you have provided to them for the purpose of connecting to your organizational systems. In that span of control, you don't necessarily have the ability to go in there and search their cell phone, for example, to see if they have accessed inappropriate websites or their laptop or their tablet. You may have the ability, if you have the appropriate permissions from your employee, to go in there and search what they've done on your system. You always have the permissions to go in and search your own system, for example. But to access their records on their devices is likely a different policy, a different factor altogether. And that's where you really need to engage outside counsel and make sure that what you're doing is not treading on privacy issues, particularly in those states that have pretty hefty privacy laws like California. Part of this also leads to what happens when employees leave companies. If they have a personal device, you cannot require that they return it to you, for example. So how do you get your information off of that? There are apps that you can require employees to load. Those apps can either completely wipe the device that it's resident on, or it could wipe just those software, just the software and the information in there that is company related. But making sure that you have permissions from employees, that they have those apps loaded, and that you have the proper permissions for those apps to be able to use them is critical, especially given the heightened focus on employee privacy lately throughout the entire nation. So making sure that personal devices, if you're going to allow them, are covered is a critical piece to maintaining cybersecurity in your organization. This also stretches into remote work. When we've all gone through this for the past 18 months, or at least most of us have, where we've been relegated to working from home. And if your employees work from home on a consistent basis, if it's a regular part of the job, you've probably provided them with equipment from your organization. And if you have, you've got the latitude to search that to make sure that there's nothing on their systems that is against company policy or that violates any of your requirements or agreements or expectations that you have in place with your employees. So your span of control on an employer-owned piece of equipment is greater than that of a remote employee who's using their own equipment. The permissions from employees are a little bit different because they're not giving you permission to access their own system. They're giving you permissions. They're actually acknowledging that you have the permission to access and control what's on your own equipment. And when employees leave, if they're working remotely, there's always that physical kind of how do I get my equipment back piece. And some occasions it's easier than others if you don't end up getting it back, if an employee who leaves the company just decides not to send the cell phone back. If it is an employer-provided cell phone, you have the ability to have wiped that completely clean. You can do what is called bricking it, which would make the employee unable to use it at all. They can't even go out and get new service for it because it will be reported as a bricked phone or a stolen phone. And that's something that's more Kirk's line of conversation, but there's that. But if they are using their own equipment, it's not that easy. You can wipe it if you have the proper software on there, and if the employees have given you permission to do so. But worst case scenario, you may end up trying through the legal channels to get your information back. So making sure that you have those things established is critical to the security of your organizational information. Now, finally, we're going to talk about training. This is not, this is my disclaimer here, this is not a topic that HR typically trains on out the gate. We handle things like, how to conduct a performance evaluation, how to do effective employee counseling, discrimination, harassment training, things like that. However, your IT department is probably an ideal source or resource to develop and administer training related to cybersecurity. And given that, it's also something that the HR department should be involved in, even though we are not necessarily the ones who generate and manage that training piece, mostly because you are talking to your employees about what their expectations are in these areas. When you're conducting a training, there's several levels. There's a sit down at your computer or in a room and talk to somebody, or somebody talks to you about what the expectations are, and they go through scenarios and all of that. And that's important, and it must be done. But there's also continual training throughout the year. Kirk had mentioned doing testing, phishing testing, and ransomware, social engineering, and being able to train your employees in the proper response to those types of emails, so that when an employee gets an email that says, hey, your bank needs your social security number to process a loan, or you've won some money, click here, that your employee isn't simply randomly clicking on these links that just pop up in their email boxes. And that can be an extended part of your training program, even though it's not necessarily conducted in a communal environment where there's a number of people sitting together learning the same thing at the same time. But in these trainings, what you are doing is you are establishing the expected behavior of an employee in a given set of circumstances. If you get this email and it has this link in it, what do you do? This is what the expectation is. And then if you do not follow this expectation, what are those repercussions? Because when you think about an IT policy or a training course that gives guidelines to an employee about anything else, so for example, attendance, and you tell your employee that you're expected to come into work every day and you're expected to be on time and to remain at work for the full duration of the shift, and they don't do that, then they're not complying with the policy. And the same thing happens here. If you set out the expected behavior, if they were, for example, to get a phishing email, and they don't comply with the policy on how to respond to a phishing email, there's two avenues there. One is they need more training, which is probably likely the case because it can be a very esoteric and obscure environment. It's hard to kind of tell some of these things, whether they're accurate or not. But repeated failures can be an indication that they're simply not complying with the policy. And as an organization, that's one of those critical pieces you want to be able to establish, is that there's been a failure to comply with the policy if you're going to enact any kind of repercussion for behaviors in this area. So training can encompass all of those things and further support and reinforce the policies that you have in place. So I am going to now open it up for questions and see if we have anybody who has any questions.
Thank you, Kelley. So
there's a lot of information. Thank you guys so much. Were there any other topics or anything else that maybe you guys have received questions on your side? We don't have any here. Just want to see if you guys had any questions on your side.
yeah, I wanted to bring up that especially the electronic funds transfer policy, one thing that I try to bring up with my clients that utilize it is sometimes those policies are great, that when limiting who has access to do electronic funds transfer, having a secondary person, especially on a certain amount of funds and over, to get secondary approval before doing those. And third, if I always like to say, include a code word or phrase if you are requesting a transfer, that if it doesn't show up, then you know you may be phished or someone's trying to take advantage of the situation. So I always like to bring that forward because I've seen this happen too many times, and it's just a matter of, even if you put in a phrase like "How's the weather? I need money," and if that phrase doesn't pop up, then you know that this may be a potential phishing scheme. So I like to bring up the EFT because that's near and dear to my heart with a few prior businesses that I worked with.
Awesome. Thanks, Kirk. We actually have one here from Ian. He's asking of what sorts of integration are helpful between HR and IT systems. So maybe that'd be something for Kirk to start talking about. And Ian, if you want to unmute yourself and maybe clarify a little bit more of what your question is, so we can just make sure we're answering that correctly, that'd be a huge help.
Sure. I just thought it would be helpful probably for Kirk to talk about things that he's seen with integrations between HR and other systems. I've seen some in my past lives, but I thought it would be helpful just to hear what he has to say.
It's for me, seeing the policies in place for making the company safer from a cyber security perspective. So as Kelley brought up, the BYOD policies, bring your own device policies, to have the employee understand that if they're using a personal device, that they are expected to have certain things done, tools installed, and that there is an understanding that, especially if they're working with a business that has sensitive data, that if they are let go, then there is going to be a need to remove that data. And what is the understanding between employee and HR and IT in those situations? So that's one integration of, you are let go. If you have a personal device, we will need to wipe it, or we will need to wipe the parts that are relevant to our organization. And that's why most companies I work with issue corporate devices instead, because it can get to be a very big muddled process. And I'm sure Kelley and the Insperity group has seen things like that before. Other things are getting buy-ins on the phishing testing and training. That alone, phishing testing can reduce breaches and compromised credentials by up to 90 to 95% if the training is done over the course of a year. I do like to reiterate that, because sometimes people are like, well, we'll just do the test once and see who fails it, and then we'll move on. But it's something that you need to continually test and see where your employee weak links are as well, because someone may pass one and then may have one that's a more directed attack and fails it, and that can bring down a company. So I'm a big proponent of the testing and training. And this actually raises a question that I have for Kelley, is I know that you can have disciplinary actions for employees that fail these tests, and I know that these, that people who may listen or watch this, that they'll need to talk to their own business attorneys and their own HR groups, but I'm curious as to what lengths of disciplinary actions you can invoke on people who fail phishing training over multiple months.
My recommendation is that you write a policy, and this is true for any policy that I recommend to clients, is that you write the policy with broad enough language that gives you room to move in. For example, if you say in your policy that, you know, if you fail a phishing test, you will be terminated, that doesn't give you a lot of options if some circumstance arises where you want to say, well, okay, we're going to give them a warning and not terminate them right now. There are very few, but they do exist, circumstances in the business world where you would absolutely, without question, terminate somebody immediately. Failing a phishing test may not be one of those that needs it. So put some parameters around it to say, you know, repeated failures. And, you know, if you quantify that and say, you know, if you fail 5 of them, we're going to terminate you. But if they failed 3 and they were pretty egregious, you may not want to wait for the other 2. So give yourself room to move in those. But also remember that there's more than just termination as a disciplinary action. There's warnings. Depending on where you work, there may be, you know, and what department these people are in, there may be the ability to cut them off from using that system. So, for example, if everybody in your company has access to the internet just simply because they're an employee, but they don't actually use it in their job, you could theoretically turn off their access to the internet for a period of time if they are proving that they're not complying with these policies. And the other part about it is when you do have a conversation with an employee who has failed, for example, a phishing test, and you want to talk to them about it, we spend a lot of time talking about, tell them what happened, tell them why they're being, what they failed at, tell them how they can improve and what the expectation is. But in that piece, you also have to let them know that by failing the phishing test that they got on a random Tuesday is tantamount to not complying with a policy that they've agreed to comply with by receiving the handbook. So you're tying those two pieces together, and you're referring that employee back to that policy so that they have the ability to review it and understand what the expectation is. And you can also work with your IT department to provide them additional training if it's necessary. So there's a lot of opportunity there to do that. But if you have somebody who's repeatedly and presumably stubbornly refusing to comply, then the termination could be an option, but that's something that I wouldn't recommend until you've spoken with your outside counsel regarding the viability and potential liability of that action.
One question that I also had, as I don't see any others, is many businesses, both some that are partners of mine and some that I've talked to in passing, have brought up about employee monitoring, especially from work from home. I know companies, especially during the COVID crisis, were worried about their employees not conducting work, that they were just sitting at home watching Netflix and occasionally doing their business. So, and again, I know it varies on states, counties, and different types of companies, different types of compliances, but what are some of the things for policies on employee monitoring as far as guiding some of these businesses along the way of what you can do, what may be in a gray area, and what you absolutely cannot do?
I would be cautious, extraordinarily cautious with certain types of monitoring. So you as an employer have the ability to monitor the traffic on your systems. So if your employee is supposed to be online, hypothetically taking calls in a call center, and there should be, aside from breaks and lunch and other authorized times offline, there should be pretty consistent traffic on their line because they're taking phone calls or responding to internet inquiries, things of that nature, then you have the ability and you have the tools in your organizational walls to track that piece. If looking at monitoring employees in a remote setting, and I'll use one of my husband's favorite what ifs is, the camera's open, we're just going to turn the camera on and see if they're sitting there. You may not want to do that. That speaks to me, and okay, I am in California, so the first place my brain goes is to our privacy law, and it's pretty rigid and it's pretty expansive. So remembering that employees who are working from home are working within their homes, and the things they do in their homes are subject to their own privacy. So being, just turning a camera on and seeing if they're sitting at their desk when they should be may actually, as innocent as it may sound, may actually be far more of a breach of their privacy than it appears. Keeping in mind, too, that a lot of people, given the fact that whole families were working from home for such a long period of time and may continue to do so, many people are working in their bedrooms. And that's kind of a fishy place to turn a camera on. So, people don't always remember to cover up their camera or to turn off their camera. I don't. And my husband will come walking through my office when my computer is turned off, and he'll shut the camera because I will have left the camera lens open. And so that's something to consider, that, you don't want to necessarily infringe on their privacy. So while you can, and maybe in your business, depending on what your business is, it's appropriate for you to track the traffic within your system to make sure that they're doing work when they're supposed to be doing work, because it should be in your system. Then if they're not, you can ask them, hey, I saw you were kind of quiet for this period of time, what was going on? And see where that goes. It's always better to engage in a conversation before engaging in any kind of a subtle way of establishing where an employee is or what they're doing. So
I know there's plenty of employee monitoring software out there to see, when they're logged in, if they're using certain services like Facebook or Twitter, or they're wandering YouTube for whatever reason. So I know I've had those discussions with companies before, what was allowed and what wasn't, and I usually specify I'm not an HR or legal expert, and you need to get that approval from them before we discuss those solutions. And there's multiples of those out there. We use a couple of clients for their salespeople to see, kind of track what they're doing and making sure they're actually doing calls as opposed to wandering around the internet and making sure they're logged in and logged out. But it's always a tricky question, and I get that often. So I appreciate you kind of expanding on that.
Well, great, you guys. I don't have any other questions on here. So if anybody has any other questions for Kelley or Kirk or anybody else of the Insperity team, we've got a couple more minutes here together. I know that we did go through a lot of information here today, and thanks everybody for joining. Kelley and Kirk, you guys did a really great job. I will send out this this recording and the deck to everybody that signed up. So hopefully, we can go through this a little bit, and it'll uncover some questions that maybe you had or concerns you have about your business, or if you know somebody that has a business that could use some assistance, Kirk and Kelley are here as well. So
yeah, I always like to say that I'm a resource primarily. So I like to be able to help businesses survive through what seems to be worse and worse times from a cybersecurity standpoint. So if you are concerned about technology, if you're concerned about anything, maybe from a technology side of what you should do or not do, I'm more than available to have those discussions. I know that I've had discussions with Kelley and the Insperity team, and they're very good at being able to look at policies as well and be able to give their advice and try to point you in similar directions as well. So I appreciate the team over at Insperity to allow me to join this meeting, and I feel like it's a very hot topic and very very topical
timely,
as well.
Timely. Yeah, it's just
so
we got to watch out from every direction now. It's so challenging to be a business owner today with more risk than ever. So yep. I think this might have brought some of that together. Hopefully it's in the front of mind of people, and Kirk is always a resource. And if you need any contacts from the HR side, everybody can get a hold of me, Jason Banks, and I'll connect you with the right people. If you want to learn more about Insperity, give me a call, and we can donate a little bit to a 501c3 for a conversation. So helping out the community as well.
Nice.
So don't hesitate.
Okay. Well, again, thank you. And